Welcome to the third edition of the New Evening Owl podcast. In this episode, we will be talking about happiness. The theory, the magic, and the miracle of something we all universally crave and can never get enough of. Enjoy or endure.
Happiness is what the soul of man travels on. It is the final destination of the human spirit. Thanks to happiness, we remain a goat with a carrot above our heads, chasing it, and chasing it, hoping to ever eat that carrot.
That's right. Happiness is a disease in a way. It ruins us, corrupts us, and leaves us empty and sucking the world around us, trying to find that golden raindrop to eternally fulfill us.
These are all very accurate insights as to what happiness is. Happiness is subjective, which makes it a genuine mystery. Happiness can look like a lot of things. It can look like a giant floating mustache floating above the Atacama Desert. It can look like a blissfully blue aura roaming around heaven throwing its fists for freedom. It can even look like a unicorn made of snow with dead trees hanging off its back. In the meantime, let's ask some philosophers, scientists, mystics, poets and artists on what they all think happiness is, and more importantly how we can attain it. Come along, my friends. Our first subject on this matter is infamous philosopher Slavoj Žižek on his stance on happiness.
Go a step further and claim that the notion of happiness itself is very ambiguous in its implications. Let me give you a couple, maybe you know some of them, I apologize in advance, examples. Maybe I even used this story here 10 years ago. I was some 15-20 years ago, I think it was Lithuania, Vilnius, their capital, and we debated when are people happy. And we came to a nice, unequivocal result. Czechoslovakia, in those darkest Husak years, in 68 they had almost this democratic socialism, it was crushed by the Soviet intervention, and then they had those 10-15 years of so-called renormalization. Why were people, one can seriously claim, happy there? 3 conditions, I claim. We established them. First, for happiness, your material needs should be basically satisfied. Basically satisfied, but not too satisfied. If you get, for example, coffee all the time in the supermarkets, you get used to it, no? It must be like that once a month you don't get coffee, because this makes you aware all the other days how lucky you are to have it. And this was exactly the situation there. People lived a safe life. It was a kind of a modest welfare society with limitations which precisely reminded you how happy you are. We in developed West don't have these limitations, so we are not so happy. Second extremely important feature. We all agreed on this. For people to be happy, you shouldn't have democracy which is taken seriously. Because if democracy really works, okay, even it doesn't really, if it works in the sense that ordinary people themselves experience themselves as the one who ultimately really decide their fate, that's not good, you worry too much. You have to have some figure of other political authority on whom you can put the blame for everything. And that was in those dark years the role of the Communist Party. As a friend from Czechoslovakia told me, even if the weather is like here, and I blame him, 2-3 days ago, all that storm and so on, oh, Chris is guilty, fuck it, like communists were blamed for everything. This makes, and I remember from my own country it was a little bit of this. This makes life very easy, like you know whom to blame. You don't feel responsible. This is second and third condition of happiness. You must have an image of paradise, of place where things are really good, and this paradise has to be at a proper distance. Not too close, not easily accessible, because if it is, then you see it's basically the same shit as where we are, but also not too distant, because then it's just a vague dream. They had it. It was West Germany, of course, you know it. Because communist authorities in the 80s at least tolerated watching Western TV and so on and so on. I seriously think that all these three features constituted a kind of perfect happiness. Because at the same time, you know, it was no longer the old totalitarianism. You were allowed your private life, your niche. If you didn't mess with politics, it was relatively comfortable to live there. In this sense, to make a place further, I think that what disturbs happiness? Desire. By desire, I mean the force which compels you to move beyond, to disturb this fragile but nonetheless stability of happiness. To give you an example that I use all the time. Let's say you live a relatively happy life, not being in love. Love is a catastrophe. You know, like you drink with friends in the evening, maybe you have here and there one night stands and so on. Life is nice. Your job goes good, then all of a sudden you fall passionately in love. Can you imagine a worse catastrophe? All the balance of your life is disturbed, you worry only about this, you are either jealous or nervous or whatever, you lose concentration for other things and so on and so on. Happiness is thus in itself confused, indeterminate, very ambiguous notion. I like this German anecdote. A German immigrant to the United States is asked, "Are you happy?" You know what's his answer? Yeah, I'm happy here, aber glücklich bin ich nicht. Like, it's not the same. So, I think that, now I will become a Christian, happiness is a pagan category. For pagans, the goal of life is to live a happy life. The idea to live happily ever after, I think, is a Christianized version of paganism. And religious experience and political activity themselves are considered the highest form of happiness. No wonder that Dalai Lama itself, and here I have problems with him, begins almost all his popular books with some kind of a gospel of happiness. He usually begins with all living beings strive towards happiness. My instant answer is maybe all living beings, but definitely not humans. If there is, and that's Freudian left.
Up next on this crucial topic is award-winning clinical psychologist and author, Jordan Peterson.
What concerns me with the current obsession with happiness is that under the rubric of happiness, all sorts of things that aren't really related are often discussed. So, for example, there are claims that happy people are healthier. Actually, the research doesn't precisely indicate that. What it indicates is that people who have less negative emotion are healthier. And we don't exactly know the direction of causality. I mean, negative emotion is a dimension in and of itself. And people who are high in negative emotion tend to be depressed and anxious. And depression is associated with increased production of a stress hormone, cortisol, and that seems to have very negative consequences over time. It impairs your immune system and makes you more susceptible to obesity and depression and cancer and heart disease. But technically, that's a negative emotion issue. It might be objected, I suppose, that the right response to negative situations is to consider how they might be made better. And I would agree with that. But the problem is that making things better and being happy are not the same thing unless you decide by definition that they're the same thing, in which case I don't believe that you're speaking within the scientific realm. because you're not allowed to put vastly differing phenomena in the same box and call them the same if you're a scientist. You can do that in normal conversation. And so, for example, if someone's suffering from a terrible illness, you might determine that aiding them would be an appropriate thing to do. And you might also consider that that would make you feel better. But to call that the pursuit of happiness is merely to be very unclear about the distinction between compassion and joy. And given the state of psychological science at this point, there's absolutely no excuse for failing to make that distinction. Nothing can drive you to find the deepest meanings of life without first realizing the absolute fragility of life. Because there's nothing that's sufficiently terrifying as realization of that absolute fragility. And it's necessary to be profoundly terrified before you can be motivated to seek out those things that are of the highest value. As a consequence of considering these ideas for many years, and especially considering the role that evil has played, say, in the 20th century, and also the role that suffering plays in life, I've asked myself deeply what the purpose of life might be. And it seems to me that life requires virtue. And so then you might ask, well, what do I mean by virtue? And what I mean by virtue is following whatever it is in your life that manifests itself to you as meaningful and right. And there's codicils to that. For example, in order to determine clearly what's meaningful and right, you have to stop lying, because if you lie to yourself or you lie to other people, you blind yourself. And then the things that might appear to you as meaningful are no longer trustworthy, because you're using an instrument that you voluntarily damaged to perceive reality, and that will lead you astray. And virtue requires humility, because you have to stop thinking that you know. And so humility and honesty are absolute preconditions. Courage as well is necessary, because you'll have to learn to come to terms with your own capacity for anxiety and dread and aggression, and even your capacity for terrible acts. And to continually set yourself right is to walk down the path, I believe, of moral virtue. Making happiness the focal point of your life trivializes your experiences, because in order to regard anything as truly important, you also have to regard its loss as truly meaningful. And that means that to open yourself up to experiences of deep meaning also simultaneously means that you have to open yourself up to the possibility of deep hurt and sorrow. I've said that some people will tell you that the purpose of life is to be happy, and those people are idiots. And it was a bit of a rough statement, but what I meant by that, it was actually inspired by a statement by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was the great critic of the Soviet prison system. And he commented that happiness is something that's done in by the first harsh blow that reality deals you. And I believe this to be the case. There are many circumstances in life where happiness is not only the wrong response, but also where the expectation of happiness as a response will put you, the person attempting to be happy, in absolutely the wrong psychological state to be prepared for what must be done. People are built, so to speak, to experience a very wide range of motivational and emotional states that only bear a tenuous relationship to one another. And the reason for that is that the environment that human beings inhabit is so complex that our adaptation depends on a variety of very finely differentiated responses. And so there is a time to be compassionate, and there's a time to be aggressive, and there's a time to be in pain, and there's a time to be anxious, and there's a time to be joyous, and a time to be satisfied. And the healthy and well-adapted person has a very wide range of finely differentiated responses, which cannot be boiled down to a single dimension, say happiness versus unhappiness. Life is not that simple, and if it was, we'd only have one emotional system. And so it appears to me that the price we pay for being is suffering. And then the issue there, and I believe that this is what the greater religious traditions of the world have been attempting to elucidate, is that the purpose of life, given that, is to identify and follow a mode of being that makes life justifiable, even given the radical necessity of suffering. If you're constantly in a state of placidity, satisfaction, and happiness, then nothing is going to affect you deeply enough. Not your own suffering, not the suffering of other people, not injustice, not the horrors of the world. Nothing is going to affect you deeply enough so that you'll become deep. And life without depth is, by definition, shallow and meaningless. And there's a problem that's associated with that. Because life is tragic and because life involves suffering, if your philosophy is shallow and meaningless, when you suffer, you'll become resentful and hostile and self-critical, and then you'll become cruel and destructive. And so not only is there a necessity for your own mental health to forthrightly confront the deepest questions of life, but if you don't, then you remain a danger to yourself and maybe more importantly to others.
It's a luxury to pursue what makes you happy. It's a moral obligation to pursue what you find meaningful. And that doesn't mean it's easy. It might require sacrifice.
The idea that life is, that happiness is the purpose of life. It's like, great for happiness, man. If it comes along, you should be thrilled that it's visiting you. But the notion that that's what you should pursue, that's the weakest possible notion. How much trouble would you want there not to be? It's a weird question, right? Because you want to have something to contend with. You want to have something that forces from you the best that you have. And so you have to have real problems, something like that. Because there's some, I don't know what it is about it. There's the overcoming and the growth that comes along with that. And then maybe if you do that properly, then now and then you get some happiness. You can sit at the end of a day and you have half an hour where your conscience is clear and there's nothing that you need to be doing, and you can relax and think, that's all right. Things are okay. And thank God for that. And that's maybe where you get your happiness.
Now we will have special guest Said Mobay discussing the one and only Carl Jung's views on happiness. Enjoy.
The word happiness would lose its meaning if it were not balanced by sadness. Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychiatrist and delver into human consciousness. So I wanted to make a video about this quote specifically because I just came across this group of hikers, old sweet ladies, right? And right now, here, the reason why I have this open, because actually it's not that cold. It's -1, and it's not windy. So, but in the last 2 weeks, we've been experiencing -15, -20 every single day. So today, it's like -1 and no wind. One of the ladies said it's like a heat wave, which in many ways it is. And the only reason I'm still wearing this right now is because I just like the way it looks. But I don't actually need it for this current weather right now. And so, but the reason why I'm so appreciative, and they're so appreciative of the fact that it's only -1, guys, and it's not windy and it's nice. It feels like a heat wave. I know for you guys like living in Florida and shit, you're like, what the fuck? But that's the truth, guys. That's the truth. -1 in December in Canada and no wind is heaven. It's a heat wave for us. So what I was saying is the reason why we're so appreciative of this moment, of this, hey, it's wonderful and it feels amazing and we're here and we're feeling warm, because we've experienced a contrast for the last 2 fucking weeks, right? We've been experiencing -15, -20 on a daily basis and barely any sun. So for a day today, even though it's not sunny, but to experience this -1, it's like, whoa, I feel happy just for that. See? So in the same way, we need the contrast. We need the contrast, guys. We need part of human existence on planet Earth. Part of the reason why our consciousness, our soul, chooses to take on this physical form in this current reality is to experience contrast, because believe it or not, we might not experience this contrast in other games. This is one of the games, right? This is one of the, you put the game in the operating system that is consciousness, you put in this game, it's called Planet Earth, and you experience Planet Earth. And one of the things you experience on Planet Earth is contrast. The way the game is programmed. It's programmed for you, for me, for everyone to experience contrast, to experience cold and hot, to experience day and night, to experience happiness and sadness, to experience love and hate, to experience all spectrums, male, female. This is part of the programming of the game of Planet Earth. And we choose to play this game on a consciousness level, on a soul level. We choose to play this game. We come here, we choose to, right? It's a fun game, it's exciting, it's challenging, it's risk-taking, it's adventurous, but it's a game at the end of the day. But hey, we come here, and part of the things we come to experience is contrast. We must experience contrast, pain and pleasure, suffering and relief, right? And we wouldn't, in this earthly existence, really appreciate happiness if it wasn't balanced out by sadness. We wouldn't really appreciate this -1, which is another way of saying heat wave in Canada in December, in late December. So if we haven't experienced -15 on a daily basis for the last 2 weeks. So, you know, something for you to think about in your own life. But I think ultimately also you want to have more of the good feelings, less of the bad feelings. So ultimately, you want to experience less of that sadness, and you still want to experience it a little bit just to feel the joy, right? It's okay to be sad. It's okay to feel all kinds of emotions. And I think part of trying to improve your existence in this game as a character, as a player, is to try and experience more of the happy feelings, more of the joyful experiences rather than the sad, gloomy ones, right? You always try to put a positive spin on it. Sometimes you just can't help it. You know what? I cried this morning. You know what I cried over? I was watching Boromir death scene, when Boromir in the Fellowship of the Ring, when he fought off those Uruk-hai, and then that motherfucker came and shot him with an arrow. I was so pissed at that motherfucker. He shot him like once, twice, 3 times, and then like fucking Boromir keeps fighting and fighting and fighting, and then, you know, Aragorn comes at the end and fucks that Uruk-hai up, and then, you know, they have this bromance at the end of it, right? Him, Aragorn and Boromir is like, you know, our people, you know, it's done, it's over. And Aragorn looks at him and is like, I do not know what strength it is in me, but I will not let the White City fall. And he gives him this thing, and then Boromir grabs his fucking, his blade at the end, puts his hand like this, Boromir gives him a kiss here, and that's it. I mean, fuck. I was crying, I had tears, I was sad. But I was also, after the sadness, I felt inspired. See, I felt inspired. I'm like, let's get up. I will not fucking let the white sands of Canada get me down. I will keep going. I will keep marching. And it was good. It was a really good moment, man. Really, crying is good. Being emotional is good. Experiencing those sadness and those, you know, the contrast is necessary. It's a necessary part of being a human being, right? And then, you know, you can channel those feelings into inspiration. So, you know, I felt super inspired after watching the scene. And I got up and I'm like, I want to make videos. I want to just laugh and spread humor now. And just want to be good. I want to have a good time, right? I want to inspire and help and not let the White City fall. And, you know, that moment touched me. It was full of sadness then. So experiencing contrast is necessary. As you advance in this video game, you try to experience more of the positive feelings as opposed to the negative ones. But experiencing those negative ones, man, necessary. And you cannot run away from it, right? At some point, if you live long enough, you might have to go through old age. And if you're lucky enough and you end up dying in your sleep, then you're lucky. But most people don't. They suffer when they grow older. But also, there are things we can do to counter the suffering and lessen those negative feelings. One of them, taking care of your health, right? The other is developing healthy mindsets about life. See, because ultimately, I heard this said once by someone, we come to experience our existence on earth because we got sick and tired of infinite bliss. And so ultimately, I think our nature is infinite bliss, infinite love. But while we're in this game, we got to do what we got to do, and we got to experience the contrast. We do what we can to experience the least amount of it as possible. But hey, you're living in Canada, it's minus 15, you can't run away from the cold, you're experiencing that. And if I move somewhere warm, I'll definitely be experiencing contrast in another way. I've heard people in California say they don't really appreciate the sun as much, they don't appreciate the beautiful weather as much, because it's there all the time. So again, that contrast in earth is necessary. And enough ranting for me. I'm repeating the same shit in the last minute. Check out my free book, 5 Powerful Habits to Dominate Life in All Areas. Leave me something in the comments. And thank you guys for tuning and watching. I love every single one of you. Thank you for putting up with my bullshit. Right? And I mean, definitely if you've been watching up to this video, you kind of like some of the bullshit that I say. So thank you. You go out and be your own bullshitter in the world. You go out and spew so much bullshit onto the world, okay? We're all bullshitters. So let's just have fun, take it easy, play the game, experience the contrast every now and then, but try to experience the joy, the happiness, the love more and more as much as we can, move into that space. And as always, don't forget to subscribe or you're gonna sleep with the fishes.
Hello again, friends. I'm Gallows, the talking foam stone castle of the secret Armada Desert. Just letting you know, we will be taking a little music break. Here is legendary comedian Ken Dodd's hit song Happiness. Enjoy. We will be back after the break.
Happiness, happiness, the greatest gift that I possess. I thank the Lord that I've been blessed with more than my share of happiness. To me this world is a wonderful place. I'm the luckiest human in the human race. I've got no silver and I've got no gold, but I've got happiness in my soul. Happiness to me is an ocean tide, a sunset fading on a mountainside, a big old heaven full of stars above, when I'm in the arms of the one I love. Oh, happiness, happiness, the greatest gift that I possess. I thank the Lord that I've been blessed with more than my share of happiness. Happiness is a field of grain, turning its face to the falling rain. I see it in the sunshine, breathe it in the air. Happiness, happiness everywhere. A wise old man told me one time, happiness is a frame of mind. When you go to measuring a man's success, don't count money, count happiness. Oh, happiness, happiness, the greatest gift that I possess. I thank the Lord that I've been blessed with more than my share of happiness. Oh, happiness, happiness, the greatest gift that I possess. I thank the Lord that I've been blessed with more than my share of happiness. I got more than my share of happiness.
That was Ken Dodd's hit song Happiness. To pick up where we left off, here is happiness in the eyes of poet Herman Hesse with his poem titled Happiness. Enjoy. That was Hermann, his poem Happiness. Now we will be looking at happiness in the eyes of artist and engineer Leonardo da Vinci on his stance on a good life. Just sit back and enjoy.
When we think of the forces that shape us, we often look back in time. We look to the events of our youth, to the influence of our peers, and to the way we were treated by our family. But while our past, or at least our conception of it, influences our sense of self, it is also true that an event of our future, and our choice of how to cope with it, also shapes who we are and who we will become. The idea of death, wrote Ernest Becker, the fear of it, haunts the human animal like nothing else. It is a mainspring of human activity designed largely to avoid the fatality of death, to overcome it by denying in some way that it is the final destiny for man. In most cases, it is our society that provides the mechanisms for helping us cope with our death. But not all societies provide adequate solutions to our existential dilemma. Some in fact promote ways of life that are more likely to end in regret than in the feeling of a life well lived. In this video, we are going to discuss why the modern Western world finds itself in this very predicament, while also offering an alternative approach to dealing with our existential dilemma, which is based on the life and ethos of Leonardo da Vinci. For much of history, myths have been the tool humans have used to ward off the fear of death. Some myths achieve this with the promise of a better future. If we can just live in the manner prescribed by the myth, then eventually a turning point will be reached where our suffering will be a thing of the past, and a blissful existence will fill the horizons of our future. The most famous myth of this type, of what is called a myth of arrival, is the Christian myth. Christian dogma teaches us that our earthly suffering, and even our death, are not meaningless events in a meaningless universe, but the necessary steps for arrival in heaven. The rise of science, however, and the skepticism this invited, made the belief in an afterlife less tenable. But the death of God only destroyed one manifestation of the myth of arrival. In place of the Christian myth, a new myth has emerged in the West, and it too promises a better future. This new secular version of the myth of arrival is built around the idea that our suffering is not so much tied to our mortal nature, but instead is a product of what we lack. If we can just find a high-paying job, move into a big house, meet the perfect partner, and all the while bathe in the admiring glow of others, then we will experience a turning point in this life. Our problems will wither away, and our money and social status will make possible a life free of struggle and strife. Ironically, in replacing the belief in a transcendental heaven with the belief in an earthly one, the modern myth of arrival has not become any less illusory. For in our more clear-sighted moments, we all know that much of what ails us cannot be cured by mere additions to our wealth or social status. To make matters worse, the modern myth of arrival does little in terms of helping us cope with the fact that one day, we too, will be sealed in a box and dropped in a hole. For on the one hand, we may be one of the few who scales the ladders of social success to great heights, but if this has come at the cost of years or decades consumed in a job we dread, and to the exclusion of activities that are more intrinsically rewarding, then it will be difficult not to feel that we have wasted our life in vain pursuits. On the other hand, if we struggle to attain the wealth and status which our society deems as necessary to enjoy life, then it will be difficult not to judge ourselves as failures and to be consumed by frustration and resentment. Success or failure, the modern myth of arrival does little to affirm our existence in the face of our ever-approaching death. Fortunately, clinging to the illusion that a better future awaits in either this life or the next is not the only way to cope with our existential dilemma. An alternative approach is to learn to live more fully now, for as Leonardo da Vinci famously put it, just as a well-filled day brings blessed sleep, so a well-employed life brings a blessed death. But what is a well-employed life? Da Vinci's motto was relentless rigor, and this gives us a clue as to the meaning of his statement. A well-employed life, according to Da Vinci, is not one in which we spend our days striving after wealth or fame, nor is it one where all our free time is spent jumping from one mindless pleasure to the next. A well-employed life is one in which we choose intrinsically rewarding projects and consistently put in the time necessary for their achievement. Looking at Da Vinci's life reveals that this was how he lived. From the painting of his masterpieces, to his attempts to invent the first flying machine, to his incredible work on human anatomy, Da Vinci's life was full of projects. Most of us, however, are not fortunate enough to have wealthy patrons fund our creative endeavors. But so long as we have some free time, we can mimic Da Vinci's life to a degree. A small amount of time devoted daily to a creative pursuit, the mastery of a skill, or some other project will over time accumulate into impressive results and open up unforeseen possibilities. The greater our skills mature, the more likely it will be that we can discover ways to integrate our passions with our careers. But even if we make no money from our projects, and even if not a single soul acknowledges our efforts, we will still benefit from this active way of life for several reasons. Firstly, living the well-employed life is the best way to counteract one of the root causes of human suffering, namely the feeling that we are stagnating. Stagnation plays tricks with the mind. It causes us to question the point of our existence and provides a foretaste of what awaits. To counter these feelings, we need change. We need the becoming that demarcates the living from the dead, and the well-employed life is a vehicle for moving us in this direction. The longer we stick with this way of life, the more we will learn of what we are capable, and the less we will be haunted by the specter of a wasted life. The second reason why a well-employed life is beneficial, even if it ushers in no external rewards, is because this way of life permits access to the optimal state of consciousness known as flow, and so gives due regard to the much-counseled wisdom that we should live more for the moment. A state of flow is not accessible on command, but instead emerges spontaneously when we are fully engaged in activities that require us to make use of our skills to a maximal degree. When achieved, the state of flow alters our perception of time, causes our sense of self to seemingly drop away, and the mere participation in whatever we are doing becomes the reward in and of itself. Unlike sensuous pleasures, which have diminishing returns, the more flow we induce in our life, the better. While the well-employed life is a good life regardless of whether it produces external rewards, it is nonetheless the best approach for reaching the ideal situation whereby we can support ourselves financially through activities we find intrinsically rewarding. Many people dream of such a life, but few attain it for the simple reason that they never get very good at what they do. Devoting consistent time to the pursuit of intrinsically rewarding projects, however, will force us to cultivate character traits such as discipline, tenacity, and grit, while also strengthening the all-important capacity for prolonged focus. With these tools in our arsenal, we will place ourselves on a path for achieving the excellence required to make this dream a reality. If external success does come our way, however, we must not allow it to divert us from the path of the well-employed life. For sometimes external success, especially if it comes too quickly, can be more of a curse than a blessing. The comforts and pleasures that money and fame offer can tempt us off course and lead us to a way of life that is worse than what preceded it. The playwright Tennessee Williams discovered this after he skyrocketed from obscurity to fame. The sort of life which I had had previous to this popular success, he wrote, was one that required endurance, a life of clawing and scratching. But it was a good life because it was the sort of life for which the human organism is created. I was not aware of how much vital energy had gone into this struggle until the struggle was removed. This was security at last. I sat down and looked about me and was suddenly very depressed. The struggle-free life that so many of us hope for is, as William suggests, not a life the human organism is suited for, and this is but another strike against the modern myth of arrival. We are restless creatures, and our restlessness is tied to our mortal nature and cannot be tamed by external success. Our restlessness can only be tamed through the continual exertion of effort towards ends that we deem worthy. And for this reason, the well-employed life is the good life, and the type of life worthy of a blessed death. We measure ourselves by many standards, wrote William James. Our strength and our intelligence, our wealth and even our good luck, are things which warm our heart and make us feel ourselves a match for life. But deeper than all such things, and able to suffice unto itself without them, is the sense of the amount of effort which we can put forth. He who can make none is but a shadow. He who can make much is a hero.
We will be taking another music break. Here is Chair Warriors band covering Porter Robinson's hit song Shelter. Please enjoy this wonderful work of audible miracles.
'cause I left behind the home that you made me, but I will carry it alone. And it's a long way forward, so trust in me. I'll give them shelter like you've done for me, and I know I'm not alone. You'll be watching over us until we're gone. Ooh. And it's a long way forward, so trust in me. I'll give them shelter like you've done for me, and I know I'm not alone. You'll be watching over us until we're gone. Ooh. I could never find the right way to tell you. Have you noticed I've been gone?
Hope you enjoyed that. Because I certainly do. To close off this episode of A Broad View on Happiness, here is legendary author and Professor C.S. Lewis on his stance on happiness. Hope you learned something from this.
Hey, Senior Worldview. So we just wrapped up the chapter on sexual immorality for C.S. Lewis. So before we move on to Book 3, Chapter 6, we're actually going to read an essay really quick of C.S. Lewis's called We Have No Right to Happiness. It's going to deal with sexual immorality as well, so it's the same general topic. And interesting little fact, this is actually the very last thing C.S. Lewis wrote before he died. So you are reading his final work. So this is attached in materials under the classwork tab where readings can be located. So make sure you actually read it, but I'm going to highlight for all of you what I think are like the main points and takeaways, okay? So when you're done with this video, be sure to complete the knowledge check. And look, I got new recording software. I'm now inside of a circle. Crazy, right? Okay, let's go ahead and jump in. We have no right to happiness. So this is how he starts his reading. He says, he's quoting something he overheard. After all, said Claire, they had a right to happiness. And what Claire is referring to, which he goes on to elaborate in this reading, is she's referring to a man and a woman who respectively left the spouses they were with to be with one another, okay? And he hears this woman talking about this occurrence, and she says, well, they had a right to happiness. And so he starts, being C.S. Lewis and thinking and pondering about this. And he has a lot to say, but before we jump into actually what he has to say, I want to ask you, first, where do rights come from? If you have me for government class, you probably already know the answer to this question, right? But where do they come from? Because the origin of something oftentimes determines what that thing is allowed to be and what it is for. So both what it consists of and its purpose, its telos, to use that word again, okay? So this is answered a little bit in our own Declaration of Independence. And before you think that I'm just throwing this in here because I want to, C.S. Lewis literally refers to it in the reading. So here's the Declaration of Independence's answer to that question, right? Where do rights come from? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. So rights can only be those things so to speak, that come from a creator, that are endowed to us or given to us by our creator, okay? So, with that having been established, there's a lot of things that he lists that become ridiculous or silly things to believe could be a right, okay? And so he's kind of making this, making fun of the idea that you can have a right to be happy or a right to happiness, because he said that's kind of like having a right to good luck, or having a right to be 6 feet tall, or having a right to be a millionaire for a father, or having the right to good weather whenever you want to have a picnic. All these silly things that it's like nothing about your nature as a human being and the fact that you get rights from God would at all result in you having a right to these things. They don't logically follow from God giving you rights. These aren't the kinds of rights God gives you, okay? If your rights are limited by the things that are endowed to you by your creator, these wouldn't be the kinds of things. So what about the right to happiness, right? This is the other right that we have to consider. I need to stop asking right when we're talking about rights, because that'll get really annoying really quick, right? So C.S. Lewis also is going to help us understand, well, what are rights themselves? We know where they come from. They come from God, right? They are given to us from on high, so to speak. But what actually are they? Well, there's two main ways of thinking about your real or possible rights, okay? The rights that you could have or actually have. So one is just a freedom guaranteed to me, he says, by the laws of the society I live in, okay? So a freedom is different than actually being given the thing, right? This is why it says not a freedom given, but a freedom guaranteed, okay? I cannot emphasize how important that word is, okay? Like, this is so important, okay? Secondly, it's a claim guaranteed. Again, there's that word, but instead of a freedom now, it's a claim, something you have a right to in terms of ownership, guaranteed me by the laws, and correlative, which means going along with or associated with, correlative to an obligation on someone else's part. This is C.S. Lewis pointing out for us that all rights entail certain responsibilities, okay? So for example, our Constitution says you have the right to a lawyer. Well, that would mean that someone else has an obligation or a responsibility to present or to represent you in a court of law, right? So some rights are just freedoms, okay? If I say you have the right to free speech, that's a type 1 right, okay? It's something that you are allowed to do, and your ability to do that thing is going to be protected. That does not mean the government is going to start giving you speech lessons, right? That's not what that means. The other option is that, no, it is a thing that's being, so to speak, given to you. It's still a guarantee, but in some sense it's being given because it entails someone else's responsibility, okay? So which one is happiness? Is it number 1 or is it number 2? Is happiness something that you're free to have, or is it something that is given to you and is someone else's responsibility? I want you to think about this for a minute, okay? Are you just allowed to be happy? Or is the government responsible for making sure you are happy? Right? Or maybe not even the government, but does someone owe you? Are you owed? Do you deserve to be happy? Or just the ability to, I don't know, pursue happiness? Okay, so again, if we read a little bit further in the Declaration of Independence, he talks about these certain unalienable rights, and he lists a couple examples: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that to secure, and this is a word kind of like guarantee, right? To keep safe these rights, governments are instituted among men. So again, our rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let's go back. Which one of these is the right to life? Okay. Does this mean that someone else has a responsibility to make sure that you stay alive? No, that would be silly, right? We're all going to die one day. That's not what they meant. What about liberty, right? Well, liberty is literally a synonym for the word freedom, essentially. So yeah, it's obviously a type 1 right. The government's going to make sure that you can remain free. It's going to protect your ability to be free. It's going to secure it. It's going to guarantee it. So what about this thing called the pursuit of happiness? Well, Jefferson was really smart when he wrote this. He didn't say that among these are life, liberty, and happiness. He said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Given that you are having a right to pursue it protected, but not the thing itself, which type is it? Is it 1 or 2? C.S. Lewis would probably say, number one, it's a freedom guaranteed to me. So let's move forward a bit. He would, if he was going to change the Declaration of Independence, or maybe put something in brackets there, he would say they meant to pursue happiness by all lawful means. That is, by all means which the law of nature eternally sanctions and which the laws of the nation shall sanction. Okay? If we go back, right? You have the right to be alive, right? You have the right to life, and that's a type 1 freedom. It's a type 1 right. Okay? The government's going to make sure that you can continue to choose life, right? They're not going to take away your life. They're going to protect other people from taking away your life. That means that one thing you don't get to do to have your right to life is take other people's lives, right? You can't do that. Similarly, okay, your ability to go after happiness, just like it is to go after life or keep your liberty, it's conditional upon some certain things. You can't just get it however you like. This isn't clear in the original text, and that is why C.S. Lewis amends it here. He says to pursue happiness by all lawful means. In other words, you're not allowed to pursue happiness if it means stealing or killing or assaulting people, right? There's these sort of assumed things you cannot do. Well, what sorts of things can you do and not do? Things that the law of nature, natural law, eternally sanctions, and which the laws of the nation shall sanction. Okay? And these laws of the nation, he's going to go on in the text to talk about how they have to be in line with the law of nature. So this begs another question then for us, which is, what are lawful means to pursue happiness, right? What am I allowed to do to go after happiness? Having established that I don't deserve to be happy in the sense that the government doesn't exist to make sure that I am always happy, but that I'm allowed to pursue or go after happiness, well, are there any rules about how I'm allowed to go after it, right? What if happiness for me is having 9 wives, right? What if happiness for me is doing tons of drugs? Am I allowed to do those things? Well, the answer is a little complicated, but the short answer is no, absolutely not. So a couple clarifications here. Remember, he's having these thoughts in the context of this woman who is talking about 2 people who in relationships left their spouses to be with one another, right? So what kind of happiness do you think she's talking about when she says, back at the beginning, right? Well, they had a right to be happy. She probably meant some kind of sexual pleasure, and this is how it ties in with what we've been going over in Christianity. Happiness is not pleasure, guys. Okay? That is not what the founders meant when they wrote this. Okay? When they wrote happiness, okay, they didn't mean pleasure. They meant something different. So happiness isn't pleasure. So you don't have a right to pleasure. If that's what you mean by happiness, sorry. You don't have a right to pleasure in the sense that you deserve to have it. Pleasure might be a way that you can pursue happiness, but it's not happiness itself. There's no right, in other words, to sexual gratification. So he says this sort of in response to this phrase that might be tossed around in his culture at the time. Why all this prudery? Let us treat sex just as we treat all our other impulses, right? And what's the connotation there? What's the underlying implication? They're saying, why are we so walking on eggshells and so worried about all of our sexual behavior? Why can't we just, live and let live like we do with everything else, right? There's something wrong with that question in the way it's phrased, because it's assuming something. There's a snug premise in there. And the premise is, right, if you were going to put this as an argument, it would be something like this. We are lenient with all of our other impulses, or we ought to be lenient with our impulses. Our sexuality is an impulse, therefore we should be lenient with sexuality. But let's look at those premises again, right? We ought to be lenient with our impulses. Should we? Are we? No, not at all, right? How do we treat our other impulses? We have impulses, desires, instincts, faculties, appetites to do other things. So for example, these relate to virtues. So if you have the virtue for courage and you lack courage, right, you are a coward, which means what should you do with that impulse to help in a situation, the impulse to be courageous? You should try to summon more of it, right? We're not just letting it be however it wants to be. Similarly, if you are charging into battle and machine gun fire head first, you're probably being an idiot, you're being reckless. Maybe you should suppress a little bit of that courage, okay? Because you're being foolhardy. You should be in the middle, you should be brave, right? This is one impulse we might feel. We might feel an impulse toward courage, which is a virtue. This idea that we should just treat it like we treat all other impulses, if we were actually being honest, would mean we should regulate it, because we regulate our other impulses. We regulate courage, right? When we don't have enough, we tell people don't be a coward. And when we have too much, we say don't be an idiot. We should be in the middle. Similarly, right? C.S. Lewis talks about the acquisitive impulse, which just means not inquisitive, but acquisitive. The desire to accumulate or acquire things, right? Acquisitive, acquire. Well, is it wrong to want things at all? Well, what if you don't want anything? Right? Maybe you're actually kind of slothful. You're lazy, right? Your desire to go and get things, to be industrious, is like close to zero. We would say, be lazy. Don't you want more for yourself? Is the kind of thing we would say to someone like that. But on the other hand, right, people that are going overboard with this are prone to avarice, is what C.S. Lewis uses, which is the vice term for greed. So where should you be? You should regulate that impulse for things to be in the middle, so that you are, oh, look at my beautiful typo there with the S on the second line. You should be industrious. You should have industriousness as part of your character. You should work hard, but not overwork, right? You should want things, but not too much, okay? Our other impulses we regulate. So when we say something, sort of like, well, why don't we just treat sex like our other impulses? We regulate our other impulses, so we should actually probably be regulating our sexual impulses as well. That's C.S. Lewis's point. Our sexual impulses are thus being put in a position of preposterous privilege. The sexual motive is taken to condone all sorts of behavior which, if it had any other end in view, would be condemned as merciless, treacherous, and unjust, right? Just because you have an impulse sexually doesn't mean you should just be like, let it be the way it is, because that's not how we treat other impulses. So why do sexual impulses get a pass? Why do we act like somehow they're immune to all the regulation that we impose on our other impulses, right? When people overeat, we go, whoa, dude, slow down. Or, you get yelled at the dinner table by your parents if you don't touch your food. Come on, eat a little bit, okay? That's an appetite. That's an impulse, the impulse for food. We criticize people all the time for the ways that they express that impulse, right? Either in excess or in what's the word? By lack of it, for lack of a better term, right? Why do we do this with other impulses but not sex? Here's C.S. Lewis's answer. It is part of the nature of a strong erotic passion, as distinct from a transient fit of appetite, that makes more towering promises than any other emotion. Hence, all seems to be at stake. When we feel sexual impulses, they are much stronger than like, oh, I'm really hungry, I could use a bite to eat, right? All seems to be at stake. We seem to think when we have those impulses, if we miss this chance, we shall have lived in vain. At the very thought of such a doom, we sink into fathomless depths of self-pity, okay? For whatever reason, the sexual impulse, the sexual appetite, is far stronger than the other impulses and appetites we feel. So we are inclined to just kind of let it slide a little bit when we really have no reason to. It's just really strong. When two people achieve lasting happiness, and here he means happiness in a more holistic sense, not just pleasure. This is not solely because they are great lovers, but because they are also, I must put it crudely, good people. Controlled, loyal, fair-minded, mutually adaptable people. For C.S. Lewis, happiness it encompasses a great deal more than pleasure, right? And here's really the main point he's trying to help you understand. Do not miss this, okay? Obtaining happiness does not rely upon you getting the pleasure that you're going after. It relies upon you following moral duties. We know this because when people don't follow their moral duties, when they are either vicious through excess or by not having enough of a virtue like courage or the acquisitive impulse or sex or a physical appetite, right? Maybe we're prone to gluttony or something like that. We criticize it because we know that if those people do things in excess or through lack, that actually won't result in their happiness. And C.S. Lewis says the same is true for sex. So this is really the big takeaway. Last note, he kind of tacks this on at the end, but it's worth noting, it's important. A society in which conjugal infidelity is tolerated, right? And so a society where we're just kind of nonchalant about the fact that affairs and things can happen, must always be in the long run a society adverse to women. It's a society that's not friendly to women. Where promiscuity prevails, and we've been talking a lot about modesty and chastity, right? In a society where being promiscuous is just like the MO, women, they will therefore always be more often the victims than the culprits. And here's all he means by that, guys. He's not trying to say women are weaker or anything. The consequences for women when we make mistakes in sexuality are generally far worse than they are for men, right? Because if a man is sexually promiscuous, right, and the woman becomes pregnant, he shouldn't, but he can walk away. He doesn't have to suffer the consequences of that action. But that woman is placed in a very different spot. So C.S. Lewis is trying to say here, you should be very alarmed about your own sexual morality, especially if you're a woman, because as a society tends downward toward a sexual morality that is flippant and nonchalant and doesn't care about this stuff, it's going to hurt women, generally speaking, more than men. So that's the lesson for today. Make sure you complete the knowledge check, and I'll see you on Monday.
We hope you found that educational. We certainly enjoy educating and bringing joy to you all. We sincerely hope you learned something from this, and we will see you all next time.